We're going to move right into this joint conversation here where I hope both of these gentlemen interview each other. There has been one sort of classic interview that Kinaul did to the gentleman on my left. But I would like both of them to ask questions of each other and begin now. Ken's going to start.
Your turn. You can all hear me now, right? Years ago, when Dr. Henry Kaufman was the chief economist at Salomon Brothers, he would go around giving these speeches all the time, and his chauffeur heard the speech probably several hundred times. And one day the chauffeur said to Dr. Kaufman, he said, "You know, Dr. Kaufman, I've heard you give that speech so often, I could probably give the same speech." And Kaufman said, "Oh, yeah?" So he said, "Okay, next speech you give." So they got in the car, and they got out of the car, and Kaufman took the chauffeur's cap and sat in the audience. And sure enough, the chauffeur gave the exact same speech that Dr. Henry Kaufman gave all the time, except they forgot one thing, the question period. And this guy stands up and asks this question. It's a very convoluted question about the gold standard, and the chauffeur patiently waited, who was playing the role of Dr. Kaufman, and he looked at the questioner and he said, "That's the dumbest question I ever heard. My chauffeur could answer that question." Mike?
I'm ready.
Norm Pearlstein said that...
I want to know, first of all, who got the speaker's fee? Henry Kaufman or the chauffeur?
They each got bags like this.
Yeah.
If Norm Pearlstein sat up here and he said one of the reasons he was depressed about the state of journalism was that even a magazine like Slate doesn't seem to make it and stand out on the web, what's your take?
I don't think that was quite the way he put it.
I'm a journalist.
You're misrepresenting. I think first of all, he said he was depressed about the possibilities of online journalism, not about journalism in general. I wish it were journalism in general. And secondly, I don't think he said it didn't make it. He said that he prefers to read it in print. And that is our two biggest challenges are getting people to read text at some length on a screen, and number two, getting people to pay for it, obviously. And we put off the second problem in order to deal with the first one for a while. And, you know, I've had moments when I thought maybe the gutsy thing to do would have been just to simply put out a straightforward, linear, old-fashioned, text-based magazine delivered by email as a document, which we do as a sort of a sidelight to Slate every week. And that's turned out to be quite a success. And just do what Denise Caruso was saying, is think of the web as a distribution medium and leave it at that. It's free because someone else is paying for the paper and printing, virtually free, and it's instantaneous, and settle for that. I think we are basically trying to do both. We have that version, and we have a version where we tend to take advantage of the interactivity, the hyperlinks, and so on and so forth. And we even have a paper version which we will print out and put in the mail to you or give away free if you come to certain conferences. And we're conducting a controlled experiment to see what works.
Let me conduct a controlled experiment in this audience, if I can, on that point. And I say this as someone who admires Slate as a reader of it. How many of you...
There was a but coming there.
No, it's not a but. But how many of you have read Slate online this week as opposed to the print version we see here? Hands?
The cool people.
The cool people. Merville rose two hands. Yeah, okay.
What percentage of you people who've read us online are actually part of our authors group? About 20%. Look, we may. I think there is no one. First of all, nobody has discovered the right answer to how to make people read journalism of any sort on the web. No one's making money at it. We have a reasonable amount of traffic. We're quite pleased with it. We haven't figured it out either. And second of all, I don't think there's going to be any one right answer. There will be, Norm Pearlstein believes that it's going to end up being mostly more like a television model, and the text will not work. I think it may be mostly that. It's like saying there's one model for what's on paper. You know, I think various things will work. And we don't have to find the answer, we just have to find an answer.
So when Bill Gates walks in the office and he says, okay, Michael, let's sit down, what is the answer? How will this make money? What do you say to him?
It will, I would say there's a small chance that we and other sites will make money on advertising alone, and a much larger chance that we will and other sites will end up charging readers of something resembling a subscription fee. And that if you add up those two chances, they add up to considerably more than 50-50. But by no means 100%. I got in trouble, I was quoted somewhere when this thing first started as saying, this is a great adventure, I think there's huge possibilities, I don't know if it's going to work out or not, I'm going to do my damnedest. And maybe it was even in the piece you wrote in the New Yorker, I don't remember. But someone from Microsoft said to me, that's not the way we talk here at Microsoft. So I stopped talking that way. We will make this work. It's inevitable. Let me ask you, Ken. You have a collection coming out of your adventures with mostly profiles of people in the media, mostly the newish media, if not the new media, most of them considerably more important than me. All of them, in fact, with one exception of me, are considerably more important than me. You are obviously staking your career on the old media. You're writing for the New Yorker. Either you or I is making a big mistake.
Probably both of us.
Yeah. Do you ever have any doubts?
No.
I mean, dinosaurs have a lot of fun, I gather. But do you ever worry that you're a dinosaur?
No, I think I'll probably I'll be okay my life. My kid might be a dinosaur if she decides to be a print journalist. I don't know. I mean, I tend to be pessimistic, but not so much because of new media versus old, but more because of the business forces as they're moving in the society. I mean, I think words like synergy and borderless company and teamwork and a lot of the notions that are very prevalent in the business world are ones that are antithetical to, oftentimes, to journalism. The very cultural notion of journalism. That is to say, if you talk about, you want synergy, if you're Sumner Redstone or Michael Eisner or Bill Gates and you're talking about synergies and partnerships and teamwork, and Jack Welch at General Electric talks about a borderless company, which is a notion that's very prevalent now. When you think about journalism, we in fact want the opposite of those things. We don't care about teamwork, we care about independence. And we care about borders because we want a border between the business side and the editorial side. We don't want to have the advertising department mucking up on the editorial side of the newspaper. And we don't want to know about going off to retreats with other divisions and making nice to them. You know, part of our job is sometimes to do things, not always, but sometimes you do things where you're going to be unpopular, and you may make it uncomfortable for, if you're at NBC and you want to write, John, if you want to do a report on Microsoft, it may be you won't think twice about it, but someone else will. And it's not that the worry is not that Bill Gates will in the new version of Kuritsu that exists in corporate globalism today. The danger is less from Bill Gates or Jack Welch coming down and saying, we don't want you to do this piece. It's much more self-censorship model that we have to worry about, and that's a teamwork model that, again, I think is antithetical to to independent journalism.
Kurt Anderson mentioned that before he went to work at New York Magazine, I had some talks with him, and I did have a meeting with Henry Kravis, which is more than I had with Bill Gates before I came to work at Microsoft. And I said to him, as Kurt recounts, that you have to be prepared to make trouble. And I said, what I think is true is, the real problem is not when you take on your owner, because the owner can steal himself or herself or that. It's when you take on the owner's friends or the owner's wife's friends, because then the owner feels defenseless and sort of feels really caught betwixt and between. And Kurt remembers, or possibly I told him incorrectly, what Henry Kravis did not say that was going to be a problem. Henry Kravis assured me that he would give his editor total independence. And I guess Kurt found out, as I should have, that those kinds of promises are not to be believed. Now, in terms of Microsoft, I have to say, so far at least, there has not been the slightest hint of any concern that about anything we've done, that it was going to cause them problems. We've linked to Netscape and urged people to download the Netscape browser, and tested them in various other ways. That's one point I'd like to make. Another point I'd like to make, a lot of people say, how can Microsoft, with its myriad business interests, own your own media and expect them to be independent? I think the general question of media conglomerates which you've written about, is a very troubling one. But it doesn't seem to me that Microsoft is a more troubling example than Time Warner or ABC being owned by Disney or anything. In fact, the number of occasions in the course of a month when we publish something that has any relation whatsoever to Microsoft's business that might conceivably cause a conflict of interest or pressure from the company is much lower than Time or Newsweek or some of these media companies, which, every time they review a movie, Time magazine, whether it's a Warner Brothers movie or somebody else's movie, they're up against a conflict of interest. And I think you can say, and it's true, that media companies, to some extent, have traditions, and their executives understand what the rules are if you're going to own media, and Microsoft doesn't. But they're learning, and so far there's no grounds for complaint at all. The final thing I would say is, and this cuts in the other way to some extent, Slate Magazine and MSNBC and other publications media owned by Microsoft are not going to be the institutions that give Microsoft the scrutiny it deserves as a powerful institution in our country. I think we try as hard as we can to be scrupulously objective, and we take occasional pokes, but we are not going to be going after Microsoft the way somebody should. What guarantees that powerful institutions like Microsoft get the kind of scrutiny they deserve is not a lot of stagey self-flagellation. The way Columbia Journalism Review will give a daisy or whatever they call it to some newspaper that does a ruthless investigation of itself. I think that's sort of silly. What guarantees that powerful institutions get scrutiny is diversity. And Microsoft entering the media business has added to the diversity of the media business, hasn't reduced it.
It has, and you can make the argument that there are more, that a citizen today has many more sources of information than they did 10 years ago, 20 years ago. The worry I have, it seems to me that the old monopoly model, which the Clayton and the other antitrust acts were designed to meet of restraint of trade because of a giant company or a conglomerate of companies, is replaced by another concern that's a little more subtle today, and it goes to this whole notion of convergence and partnering. All of these companies are seeking to have partners and to mate, and so inevitably the danger becomes what Rupert Murdoch did say in Asia with the BBC to try and placate the Chinese government. He says, I'll dump the BBC, or AOL dumps and I think Steve Case is still here, but I did not meet him, but I'd love to ask him this question. You know, what happened to the Bill Gates website? Why was that dumped soon after there was a business arrangement with AOL and Microsoft? Those are the concerns, and it goes back to that self-censorship thing that I think is much more troubling. You know, you take England, we'll take Indonesia, and kind of spheres of
It's a
influence.
deal.
Yeah, right.
I think you're right, and I think you're actually too kind to the new media to say that it's a problem that transcends them all, because the old media have traditions. They also have conventions. To take a very mundane example, you open up a traditional paper magazine, and you know every reader knows what's an ad and what's editorial. And there's controversies about advertorial and how often it must say advertising, stuff like that. But basically, these are people know how to read them. On the web and on online in general, those conventions don't exist yet. I think one of the challenges we face is to develop them, because they are the things that reinforce the separation of church and state. And at Esther Dyson's conference a few months ago, I raised this with Steve Case. I don't know, is he here or not? And he was very honest in admitting that he's utterly corrupt. No, he was very honest. He was very honest in saying that journalism, as it's developing on the web, is not of that rigorous church-state model, and he said he thought it never would be. Now, we're trying very hard, at least at Slate, to make sure it is.
You know, one of the questions you mentioned, Esther Dyson, when I was doing that profile of Michael last spring, Michael posited the notion that he is an editor. He saw his role very much like a chef in a restaurant. He's preparing a meal and offering it to the reader. Esther made the argument to me when I interviewed her that in fact that's the wrong model. The right model for an online publication ought to be a bartender. And you come to the bar and we're offering you different things, and maybe you'd have your meal at the bar, or you'd have a drink, or there'd be much more interaction than there is, say, with a chef in a restaurant. And some of this spilled over in the last session we had.
Part of Esther's point was, as a bartender, you got to listen to all these drunks who are talking to you. Well, I think Norm Pearlstein made the same point with a different metaphor, where he said it's one thing to say that the musicians are interactive in the sense that they take feedback from the audience about what kind of music they play. It's another thing to say that you want interactive music in the sense that you want the audience stepping up there and playing the music with them. I continue to be a bit skeptical about that, but my basic feeling is what I said before: there isn't one right answer. And Esther can run her bar, and I can run my restaurant, and we can both be perfectly happy. And in fact, our restaurant has a bar. We call it the Fray, and I go in there a fair amount, and I will concede that it is a bit more interesting than I expected, and that in fact it is quite, I hate to use the word cool, to write a piece and to post it, and within 24 hours be able to go in and see how people are reacting to it. And that is a great satisfaction to our journalistic egos. Perhaps you don't have one, but most writers I know do, and that is an advantage. But I think it's sterile and pointless to say that any one way of doing it is absolutely wrong. I mean, cyberspace is a big place. There's room for everybody. Let me ask you about the New Yorker. Two questions. The New Yorker is probably the only major publication that has not succumbed to web fever in any way.
Well, I noticed they just did. They just.
And why is that? And congratulations, I guess.
Well, fortunately, I'm just a journalist. I don't have to speak for the business side. I don't know why they haven't been more active. It seems to me they should be.
Really? And what?
That surprise you?
Yeah, it does. What would the New Yorker gain from being on the web?
I mean, I think it's. I was at the same conference in Davos that Richard mentioned before, and it was about 2 weeks ago, and I was interviewing. It was a panel, and I was moderating a panel, and Andy Grove was on it, and some guy from some telephone executive who was just fulfilling the stereotype of a telephone executive, I guess, he said, what's your business plan for the internet? And Andy Grove looked at this guy like he was a Martian, and he said, business plan? He said, do you think Columbus had a business plan when he set out on his boat? He said, the plan is you go there, you plant your flag, and you wait, and you figure it out, and you be prepared to lose a lot of money, but you get there first, and there are advantages to getting there first. I don't know what those advantages are yet, but I know they usually are advantages.
Let us all know when you figure it out.
No, but that's the argument I'd make. I mean, I think that was a fair argument. That's the argument I would make to the New Yorker person. Lose more money.
Let me ask an old media question. As someone who's bridged the old and the new New Yorker, a lot of people. I was talking to a writer who wrote for the New Yorker for years, who gave me just the other day, who gave me the standard rap that Tina Brown has made it vulgar, disgusting, shallow, sounds like it ought to be on the web, doesn't it? How have you managed to be the only? You're just about the only writer you're one of the leading writers who's managed to bridge the old and new.
I actually hadn't been at the New Yorker for 6 years. The 6 years prior to Tina Brown's arrival, I was actually off doing a book called Three Blind Mice on the television networks, and which coincided with Bob Gottlieb's reign as the editor of the New Yorker. So I hadn't been there at all. In fact, the only time I had talked to Gottlieb about doing a piece, I had called him, and he's a great editor. He was a great editor at Knopf, and he still is, because he was the editor of Catherine Graham's book. Yeah. But he was out to lunch about certain things, and this story I think illustrates it. I called him that in 1988 that I found out that Saturday Night Live was going to Moscow, and I was in the process of doing this book, and I said, God, this is a great story to go. This has to be a momentous cultural event. If Saturday Night Live can get in, here they are trying to block out Radio Free Europe and stuff, and they're going to let Saturday Night Live with its subversiveness get in there and all its advertising and everything else. It'd be fabulous. And I told this to Gottlieb, and Gottlieb says, no, we're not interested in television. And if the question were, I want to do a piece on the web, he would have said, this year would be, I'm not interested in the web. And I just thought, he was editing the magazine as if he were a museum curator, trying to protect something else. She came in, and I think she saved the magazine. I think the idea that I once had a 4-part series called The Underclass that ran in the New Yorker in the early 80s, and I was very glad, but no one will read 4 parts anymore. And they certainly won't read 4 parts on things like, tomatoes or something like that. So I think the notion that people don't have the same amount of time, they have a lot more choices of things to look at and read, and that their time is more precious, and you have to introduce some pictures which didn't exist in the old New Yorker. I think she has helped save that magazine. She's a brilliant editor. I think they do some things that I don't like. I didn't like the pictures of Cato Kalin. I didn't like some of the pictures that have run the magazine. I haven't liked some of the pieces. I didn't like the fashion issue. I thought that was a silly issue. But I think, no one bats 1,000. I think she is a pretty remarkable editor.
I agree with that. Let me ask you about your journalistic practices. You go and you call people up and you say, I want to interview you at enormous length.
Yeah, I want to write a nice piece about you. Can I talk to you?
Yeah. Now, I was, of course, desperately whoring for publicity, so that was why I cooperated. But why would Rupert Murdoch, to take one example, decide to give you this amount of time and allow you to this kind of exposure to him?
Well, there are two answers to that. One is that most people, the thing that is often not looked at in journalism is how much time you have to invest to get someone to talk to you. In Murdoch's case, I have been working on him for literally 2 years. And I mean regularly. If I would talk to him for another piece I was doing, or I'd run into him at some function, I would always try to bring up this question. He did not want a piece. He said, I don't need it, I'm not interested, blah, 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 blah. I finally got him to talk, and that begs the question, well, why did he agree to talk? I said to him, which is true, I said, Mr. Murdoch, I said, I've profiled a lot of people who are big figures in the communications world, be it Redstone or Eisner or whatever, and I feel Malone. I feel like I have to profile you too. And he says, well, I don't really need it. And finally, he succumbed. And the reason he succumbed, I'm convinced, is vanity, which is the same reason that everyone talks. We don't have subpoena power as journalists. And vanity is a word that has multiple meanings when you think about it. Yes, part of it is that they want to see the name in print, but Murdoch cares less about that than someone who's trying to start a business and they want to see their name and their company in print. With Murdoch, and I think this is true of most people that I've profiled, you get to be that level of success, be you Jack Welch or Bill Gates or Rupert Murdoch or Michael Eisner or Michael Ovitz, the former Michael Ovitz, not the current Michael Ovitz. You get to be that level, you are absolutely convinced, and it's vanity, you are absolutely convinced that you could take anyone. And I don't mean just in a barroom fight. I mean you could persuade them of your point of view. That's what you do all day. That's why you rule this company. You believe that you can convince people, be it investors, potential investors, or your employees, or a mere journalist, of the rightness of your cause. And so when Murdoch sits with me, as he did for probably 15 hours of interviews, and he let me sit in his office for about 7 days as a fly on the wall, he literally came at a point in time to just see me as a point of seduction, that he's going to seduce this guy. In this case, it didn't work. I wrote a piece called The Pirate, and he wasn't happy with it. But what happens to, and this is the human thing, and it's true, and it's kind of interesting, the dynamics of it. They all use the same word if they don't like the piece, which is, he betrayed me. And you think about it, it's a love phrase. I mean, it's a phrase that someone is sitting in your office, you're opening yourselves to them, and if you don't like what they've done, somehow you've rejected them, and therefore it's not their fault, it's your fault, therefore you have betrayed them.
Now, Janet Malcolm, wrote an essay on that very concept of betrayal, and her point was that it was a betrayal, that even I find it hard to believe that Rupert Murdoch is so naive that he could in any sense allow you to con him, and that he conned himself. But is it you do call up, you do come by, you do make nice.
I laugh at the joke, sure. I mean, I may even laugh harder than the joke merits. But
so is it a betrayal?
No, I think Malcolm's point. Malcolm has a half a point which she prosecutes in a silly way, I think. The half a point is that there's clearly, in the process of trying to get someone to talk to you, there are certain things you don't do. You don't tell them, you don't give them advice, you don't tell them, I like you, you don't let down your defenses, but you do laugh at their jokes, you nod your head as if you understand, you're taking lots of notes, I take lots of notes, and that in itself is something that makes people feel secure. God, I must be saying something important, he's taking it down. They don't know I'm just anal. I take everything down, and I don't trust my tape
You're writing,
recorder.
what an idiot this guy is.
The problem with Malcolm's argument, it seems to me, is that she assumes that if someone claims that they are betrayed, therefore they must be betrayed. In other words, she's taking their word for it, not the journalist's word. In other words, Murdoch may say, in this particular case, that I betrayed him. Just because he says it doesn't mean I betrayed him. That's his take on it.
One thing he cannot say is the other thing every journalist in this room is familiar with. If Mr. Arletta had bothered to check with me,
That's right.
you spent 15 hours, I think that's beyond.
Mike, what's the... We talked when you were about to launch Slate and when you still had hopes of charging for it one day.
We still have hopes of charging for it one day.
What day might that be?
I think June 30th. What do you think, Nathan? June 30th, 1998.
Why not?
All right.
That's a business plan.
Yeah. Plus a couple years, let's say.
What has... I mean, you have taken a lot of shots from people, including some in this audience. Michael Kinsley is a Luddite. Michael Kinsley is a Neanderthal. But one of the
dinosaur.
Dinosaur who knows about fornication but what is your impression, if I can provoke you, what is your impression about the web culture that suggests, that the reaction, the kind of sneering response that you receive?
Well,
Come on, be provocative, Michael.
It's not, I don't think it's because of attacks on me. I mean, there's a pretty vicious attack on me in the old-fashioned print medium this month, in Vanity Fair, which I think outdoes anything even Wired has managed to come up with in the past year. I do think that there's a certain... I have a problem with this concept of attitude, which is sort of a free-floating sneeriness. I think it's fine to sneer at things in particular if you're deriving your sneering from some... I think it's okay to have an attitude, which is an opinion strongly expressed, derived from some reflection. But this general sort of attitude, I'm so hip I can't stand myself, does bother me. And the other thing that bothers me is this sense of exclusivity that was sort of what we were discussing before. Only we have the right answer to how the Internet's supposed to work, and anyone else has the wrong answer. First of all, nobody has the right answer yet on the evidence. And second of all, why can't we both have the right answer? And the sense of territoriality, which seems to me cuts against the whole idea of cyberspace, rubs me the wrong way. But basically, I love it. I got to pander to the audience a little bit at the end. Thanks a lot.
Okay, I promised Ken that he would make a plane, so that's...
I'm
that's
okay.
why
I got a car.
That's why you
The
have to
cab's
go.
coming in.
Yeah.
We're fine.
You're okay?
Yeah.
You can keep on going for another few. When you want to get up, you
Okay.
go, okay?
What if they want to get up?
Don't applaud.
It's very easy. I'll let another room pull in.
For the same price?
Sometimes there's repeat speakers, and sometimes there's not.
All right, since you hit me with a hard one, I'll hit you with a hard one. There are critics of Ken Auletta, and goodness knows I'm not one of them, who feel that basically your profiles are not the way Rupert Murdoch reacted, but that you're too adulatory. Now, in my personal experience, I thought your piece about me was brilliantly balanced and honest and accurate in every detail. But what do you think about the general complaint?
Like you, I've gotten some shots from people who think I was too kind to someone. My philosophy as a journalist is that I am not a prosecutor. and I don't want to sit and hit my readers over the head with a 2x4. My job is to go out and even someone who does things that I find distasteful, like Rupert Murdoch's journalism, which I find repugnant in most cases. My job is to understand Rupert Murdoch. If I have access to that guy, my job is to try and understand why does he do what he does. And if I have access to John Malone, that's my job, to try and understand this person. I am not there to hit you over the head as a reader with my prosecutorial points or my attitude. My job is to understand. So I actually see myself, and I see journalism, as being in the education business. And I'm not interested in punishing and writing a piece that's basically a screed about someone. I assume most people we write about are not Hitlers. They're more complicated than that. And so my job is to try and understand them. And Murdoch is a guy who, as a businessman, in terms of what he's done with the News Corp, he's absolutely brilliant. It's breathtaking how entrepreneurial he manages to keep that company. And some of the daring things he's done, and bold things. Just look at Star TV in China. I mean, I find repugnant what he did with the BBC and some of the joint ventures he's done with the Chinese government. But the fact that this guy will bet the company on Star the way he betted on Sky in Europe and succeeded on that. I mean, so despite these are things of some wonder to me that he does this, and yet on the other hand I see so much, but even not all of his journalism. I mean, he has not ruined the Times of London. I mean, the Australian, which is the first national newspaper in Australia he started, is a good, solid newspaper. So people are complicated. I mean, that old saying from Christopher Morley that truth is a liquid, not a solid, I think is true. I mean, I think that's a general rule that journalists ought to try and follow, particularly if we have the luxury of time and space, which books or a place like the New Yorker allow.
But there's something, isn't there, about the New Yorker type profile, the accretion of detail, the getting to know this person intimately in a non-critical, not necessarily favorable, but a non-critical way, that inherently glamorizes them, isn't it? This person is so important that every detail of their life is recorded. And doesn't that cut against, I mean, you are, in terms of the actual issues, you're extremely critical of a lot of what's going on in the media today, and yet your pieces glamorize unintentionally perhaps, but in effect glamorize the very people who are doing what you don't like.
You could make that argument. I wouldn't. But it sounded like an aside. I was actually being serious. I think that there is something to Michael's point that it's inherently glamorizing to treat someone and give the details of their lives. But the truth is, these are powerful people, and we ought to know about them. But when I have in a profile of Sumner Redstone and his company, and I describe a scene which normally most journalists wouldn't have access to, he's allowing me to sit in his budget meetings as he goes out to Paramount, another example of synergy that has so far failed, Viacom and Paramount marrying together, and Blockbuster. But in the course of this, someone from the TV department is describing how Inside Edition, how much money it's making and how wonderful it is. And that morning, Redstone had said to me, have you read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book on Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt? And I said, I had. He said, you know, it's wonderful. He said, the way the press used to respect privacy and how they wouldn't go into the fact that Franklin Roosevelt, you never saw pictures of him in a wheelchair, and how they were much more respectful of the privacy of public figures, and it doesn't happen anymore. It's disgusting. Switch to this budget meeting where he's listening to this disgusting report from Inside Edition about some of the disgusting things they do to violate the privacy of people. And so I asked him after the meeting, I said, Mr. Redstone, how do you square what you said to me this morning with applauding the profits of Inside Edition and doing more? They were then talking about doing another show called Gossip. And he literally said, well, you know, I don't watch much television. All this is described in the piece. All this is described in the piece. And I said, he said, I don't watch much television. He said, I'm going to get in trouble here. Why didn't you tell me you were going to ask that question? I said, that's not my job, Mr. Redstone. You know. And he says, come over here. And he calls over the head of the TV department, and I ended the section of this profile with this dialogue. He calls over Carrie McCluggage, who runs the television department, and says, "Carrie, what would you say to this question? What's your answer to this question?" And so I repeat the question. McCluggage says, we're in business. We're not in news. This is a business decision." And, you know, but I leave to the reader to make the judgment on that. I don't have to sit here and say, "Can you believe Carrie McCluggage said that?" If you're intelligent, you get the point. And it's there. And so you could, and this is where I disagree with you, you could conclude, well, why are you giving me so much space on a guy who's as shallow as some of the Redstone appeared to be in this particular instance? Or you can say, look at this particular instance and say, wow, can you believe this guy is so shallow?
If you're intelligent, you get the point. I think on that note, we'll end it so you can catch your plane. Thanks a lot.